Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy. Hey, Bruce.
Hey, David. How are you doing today?
Yeah, good. A little bit of a colder day out there.
Yeah, it's down to zero overnight, and frost on the pumpkins. It's that time of year, right?
Alrighty, so Bruce, quicker than expected. And quicker than I had hoped, honestly, because I was thinking that you could get some bargains if you waited in the free agency period, if you just were a little bit slow on certain things. That's when you might want to do your shopping. But Ken Holland does he does appear, by his statements at least, to probably be done. There's still people holding out hope that the Oilers will make a trade, some kind of trade, or maybe buy out Jujhar Khaira. Jonathan Willis, our old colleague, mentioned that idea, which is a bad idea. Buy out Khaira and sign another forward. Very little. The buyout would cost $300,000 over 2 years in cap hit. And there are lots of good forwards who are going to be had for $1 million who are a lot better than Jujhar Khaira. I didn't hate the idea. Anyway, whatever Jonathan was suggesting, I don't think is happening. I think the Oilers are done. I don't think they're going to be moving Chris Russell or Jujhar Khaira or anything like that. I think they're done. Ken Holland has been on the radio, a couple different radio interviews I've heard where he's strongly intimated, at least from my hearing, and I'm hoping to hear otherwise. I'm hoping to hear he's going to do something more. But from what I'm hearing, both on Oilers Now and in NHL Network interviews, he sounded like they're done. And they've got 22 out of 23 contracts. They've got to sign up Ethan Barrie, and I think William Lagesson. I think he left that out. I don't think. And Lagesson is a key contract, actually. I'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
So, Bruce, it sounds like they're done. We did a poll. Maybe I should try to find the exact results. But essentially, the results were 85% of Oilers fans, and there was more than 3,000 people who took this poll. 85% either gave Holland an A or a B, with most people giving him a B. And I think that I would give him a B as well. What would you give him?
Yeah, B sounds about enough, frankly. I mean, but I at least understand what he was doing, and I do understand that he was working with one hand tied behind his back because of cap restraints, and so he had just a limited amount that he could do, and he had a couple of ways he could have gone, and he really could afford one decent,
player
plus over $2 million contract. He basically had $8 million to sign 4 players, as I reckoned it. And at the end of the day and a half, he'd spent $7.9 million on 4 players, and plug, all those holes were filled with plugs. And
not plugs literally, or figuratively.
I'm joking a little bit, but actually he went for a very offensive look. In terms of the guys that he got for the price that he got them, you'd have to say Tyler Ennis primarily an offensive player, Kyle Turris primarily an offensive player, Tyson Barrie definitely primarily an offensive player, and even the guys that he signed for the minor leagues, Alan Quine and Seth Griffiths, those guys are scoring players in the AHL level. So he really seemed to be looking to bump the offense. And, he's not wrong in the sense that he had the number 1, 2 scorers in the NHL last year, and yet his team still finished 14th in goals for. And so you need more secondary scoring than what we've got. I wrote a lengthy piece about this a couple days back. And I mentioned that out of 671 NHLers with 400 minutes. So basically 31 teams at 12 forwards would be almost exactly that number. And the Oilers had 5 guys in the top 60 and 6 guys in the bottom 40. And only 1 guy in between, Josh Archibald, and even he scored at a 4th line rate. So they have 5 very good scorers at 5-on-5 and nothing else. So I did not count Tyler Ennis in there because he didn't play 400 minutes with the Oilers. But obviously, Holland went back to his own roster to bring back Tyler Ennis. Who, in fairness, he was a new Oiler. He's not going back to the well. He only was here for 9 games. And he went back to the well for Mike Smith. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. And he went back to the well for Jesse Puljujärvi. And you know what? There's only two new players on this roster that haven't played with the Oilers before. Just two guys, and Barrie and Turris. So he must clearly have liked the team that he put together last year because he really has most of it intact at this moment, other than
Turris maybe
Klefbom.
Turris might be kind of like a, and I don't, I'm not, this isn't going to sound good, but he might be kind of like an Eric Belanger signing, except instead of signing Belanger, I think they got him at 33. We're getting Turris, oh, my cat's here, at, he always pesters me to be fed, at age 31 or 30, whatever it is. So it's a
He's
couple
just
years earlier in the
Mhm.
cycle. And of course, Turris was a better player than Belanger ever was in the NHL. I mean, no one ever said Eric Belanger was a first line center. And some people thought that of Kyle Turris for a few years. So maybe that comparison isn't that apt, although I do see them as finesse centers who can put up some points. Um,
Well,
anyway,
Belanger used to always put up 40 points,
yeah, there you go.
and he just 40, but he'd do it year after year. But the other thing is they signed him for 3 years and wound up buying out the third year, whereas Turris is only 2 years. Now, that one thing Holland doesn't seem to be doing is investing big term in anybody. He likes 1 and 2 year deals, and that's pretty much all he's done.
So the offered reportedly, Bruce, 7 years to Markstrom at 5 million. And and if he had done that, I'd be trying to convince myself, like I think I said this before, trying to convince myself it was a good move. But uh, I don't see that as a good. That would not have been a good move. I don't think $5 million cap hit, like for maybe for a few years, but after that, like a goalie going into his 30s, Markstrom's got a good record, but it's not a stellar record, and he could easily crash. So yeah, I like the. So you're getting at what I like the most about the direction of the Oilers. They signed all attacking skilled players. We've talked about three scoring lines forever in
Yep.
on this podcast, all over Oilers Twitter, everywhere. Three scoring line. This is the direction they're clearly going in. It's not just like maybe at any now. Clearly,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to go for one shutdown line, and that I could see that line being Haas. Let me just go on my list here. Haas, Gaetan Haas, Josh Archibald, and Zach Cassian. As things play out, I think that could be their shutdown checking line, which could be a really good energy line. Like that, those are three pretty good players, if you ask me. Cassian certainly paid like one, so I hope he's one. And but other than that, Bruce, they could have three scoring lines. And so as I envision the lines, Ennis, McDavid, and Puljujärvi on
Ah,
line one,
okay.
RNH, Draisaitl, and Yamamoto on line two. Yeah, and you don't break up the best line in the league unless you're nuts. Sorry, coach. And James Neal, Kyle Turris, and Chase on, kind of replicating an effective line in the playoffs, except putting Turris in for Kara. And that line, I think, Turris isn't a great puck carrier, but I think he's a little bit more of a puck distributor and carrier than Kara,
Yeah.
definitely, without a doubt. So you put him between those two veterans, and you have this really veteran kind of line to throw out there as your third. I don't know which is the third line, which is the fourth line. It doesn't really matter. But I think you have two pretty functional lines at the bottom, more functional than in the past, and three lines. Would the Turris Chase on Neal line score much at even strength? Well, I think they might be able to put in. We'll see. I mean, I like Chase on as a player. He bangs hard. James Neal has I think a bit left in the tank, and we'll see what Turris has. But those could be the three lines. Now maybe you put Puljujärvi on the mix it up, put Puljujärvi with Turris to give that line an obvious young puck carrying threat,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of tell Jesse, okay, you're the man on this line, go
Mm-hmm.
for it, and that could work as well. So there's all kinds of different combinations, but I see three lines that can score here, and I'm pretty thrilled about that.
That's my take is that Puljujärvi will team up with Turris on the third line, and he won't, the high expectations of putting him with Connor and Leon, put him on a different line and put him in a more of a feature role where they're going to be playing less against the very top guys on the other team, right? I mean, you play with Connor, you're playing against all the top uh, all the top defenders and checking lines of the other team, and ideally you get some of the secondary scoring to take on some of these soft minutes where the other team, eventually they're going to have to play their third line, a third pairing. And if your third line is talented, uh, they can take advantage of that. And I see Turris and Puljujärvi as being a duo, and what goes on the left side. I mean, it could be Neil, it could be Ennis. For now, my default is the three guys they just signed. Ennis, Turris, Puljujärvi is the new third line, and they're
Heck of a
building
third line.
on that.
Don't
Yeah,
mind, don't
not
mind it
bad.
at all. And I left out from my list of the top four lines there players like Tyler Benson, Judra Kara, Patrick Russell, Joakim Nygard. And Joakim Nygard, if he's healthy, I think would be in that top 12. I think he's a better player than right now the James Neal. He's a better player than Josh Archibald, frankly. I think Joakim Nygard, if he's healthy, he offers more to
Nice
me.
to
Oh,
see.
yeah, it would be nice to see, and I hope we see that. So, Bruce, I guess I was just thrilled. And the other thing that they solved, if they wanted to, let's say they just really wanted to go for an attacking defense this year. Let's say, and even if Oscar Klefbom is out for the whole
Yeah.
year, you could still pick a lineup with 6 puck moving defensemen on this team. You could go with Caleb Jones, Darnell Nurse, and Philip Broberg on one side, Ethan Bear, Tyson Barrie, and Evan Bouchard on another side. And so this is 6, and we're at this point where we've cleft bombs out and we've benched Russell and Larson. So the whole idea that the reality that the Oilers don't have puck moving talent on the team, and that's a real weakness on this team. Suddenly, especially if Broberg turns out as everyone's hoping, as I'm hoping, and Bouchard turns out, suddenly this team, we've got some real threats back there, and it's kind of thrilling. And Tyson Barrie, I mean, they could really launch a great attack from the back end, something that they haven't been able to do well since 2008-09 when they had a pretty
Yep.
good group, I guess.
They had 4 good ones in 08-09 that all scored over 30 points, and one that scored over 50 points, which hasn't happened since.
So this is thrilling. And I mean, we'll see what happens with Broberg and Bouchard, but I just love that direction as well. And Tyson Barrie is a huge part of that. Like he gives both Broberg or Broberry, as they call him in Sweden, and Bouchard time to develop. There's no need to rush Broberry. He could be not this year, but next year.
Right.
And you'll go
It's
with
only 19 years old.
that's right. And you have Caleb Jones and Russell and Nurse and the rest of them. William Lagesson. Let's just talk briefly about this, because one of the things that worries me a little in looking at this roster is the expansion draft coming up and how you're going to keep hold of Caleb Jones.
Yep.
And so I think they're going to need to sign. Now, if Clefbaum's on the IR all year, could you expose him in the expansion draft? Would you? Is that allowed? Do we know that or
I
not?
don't think you're allowed to expose them if there is, any sort of long-term. You're not allowed to say he's the guy we're exposing to you when the guy is racked up. So I don't think that's a way out. I think if they didn't protect him, Seattle would be able to pick him, but Edmonton would still need to put another player that met the criteria onto the list.
So maybe they
Uh,
need to sign Lagesson on a 2-year deal, Bruce, at
mhm.
NHL minimum. Give him 2 years.
Yep.
I think he's good enough to like. I'm not worried about that because I think William Wild Bill, excuse me, can play in the NHL as a 7th D or third pairing D man. He's not a bad hockey player, William Lagesson. People haven't seen him much in Edmonton, but the guy can skate. He's physical. He can make a play like as a 7th D man. He's actually kind of perfect. So plug in on your
Yeah.
third pairing. So maybe they should sign him to a 2-year deal. Does that make sense?
It does. In fact, I wrote an entire post on this very theme about maybe 3 months ago now about Lagesson and suggesting how he might be key to the Vegas expansion draft, but he would have to be under contract. So they could either sign him for 1 year and then re-sign him during the year during the expansion draft, so they can go that way,
So they
or
can
they
do
could just
that.
or they can just give him a 2-year pact. If they give him a 1 year, then they can open negotiations on January 1st, and they could easily extend him then. So that's one option. But the key is he would have to play 40 games for Edmonton, or the equivalent in however long the season is going to be. I think they'll probably prorate all that stuff. But basically, you'd have to play half the games to make the threshold. And
Okay.
otherwise, they're going to have to expose somebody who maybe they don't want to, with Caleb Jones being sort of the obvious guy that's right in the bubble on that score. So, given that Jones, the progress he made and the great 2-year contract he signed, my thinking was they should either sign Lagesson or Benning to a 2-year extension. If they could have got Benning for the contract that Nashville got him for, 2 times $1 million, he would have been ideal. But unfortunately, he got that in Nashville.
Can you trade for a guy? Like, could the Oilers wait till the trading
Oh,
deadline and then trade for a guy who's played 40 games, like who's
oh,
met the
sure.
requirement? It doesn't have
It's
to be
full,
for your team. It's just 40
right
NHL
in the
games.
NHL games, either 40 games this year or 70 games in the last 2 years. That the guy has to have under his belt. So sometimes you might have a guy that got hurt and missed a bunch of time this year, but he's been on your team for a while, and over 2 years he's played enough games. So there's lots of choices out there, and there's other guys. I mean, they could go out and sign a guy, uh,
They couldn't sign a guy because the draft will come before the UFA period, so
right.
they
No, I
can't sign a
mean,
guy
sign a guy now
right now. One who's already played 70 games, I
who's
guess.
already played, 50 or 40, 50 games, whatever. I mean, say they went out and signed Slater Koekkoek, and if they sign him 2 years, and he's already got probably 60 games that he played in Chicago last year, so he'd only have to sort of be a spot player, and he would be the kind of player they could expose. But I mean, I actually like him as a signing as a depth defenseman who could play games. But
Well, maybe that kind of player is going to be available, Bruce, like an actual NHL D man who might spend a lot of
Mhm.
time in the minors. You're kind of writing off Lagesson at that point as your seventh D man,
Well,
but
there's yeah,
you have to also factor in the expansion draft. What you could do is go with Lagesson, and then at the trade deadline, you could pick up someone probably for a pretty cheap, just to meet that requirement. That might be a possibility because they have the same issue in net, if I'm not mistaken. They have to expose at least one goalie. So I don't know how many games the goalie has to have played. I'm not sure about that.
yeah.
Uh,
The goalie has to be. He doesn't even necessarily have to be signed, but they have to have signing rights to the goalie because there's so few goalies. Like some
could that be
teams can
Mike
get.
Smith then?
Well, they don't have signing rights to him because he'd
Oh,
be
because he's a
unrestricted.
UFA. So it
So
couldn't be Anton Forsberg. So they like let's say it's
no,
Forsberg. Maybe you just
yeah,
sign
but you have to
Forsberg to
play a
another deal.
you have to play a number of games anyway. There's work. The goalies are different because there's so few of them. But with a defense and forward, there's a hard and fast rule. I think it's one defenseman and two forwards have to be available who've been regular NHLers. It's sort of the definition of that 40 games in the last year or 70 over the last 2 years under contract. And so that forces the teams to get their ducks in a row and uh, you know get guys signed and uh, with decent NHL experience under their belt to expose. So
All right. So it sounds like it's something you can keep working on as the year goes on. I mean, as you're thinking about things and
mhm.
it doesn't have to be solved right now necessarily. You have till the trading deadline to solve it, and even well, I guess you can't solve a player. It's got to be solved at latest by then.
Right.
And a number of teams might be looking for solutions, so that may limit your options as well. All right, Bruce, do you have any final thoughts on if this is it? How, what do you like what you see? Do you think they're protected enough on left defense if Clefbaum is out?
Well, I'd like to see them get a Slater Koekkoek or similar. Just get one more D man in there. I mean, I'm looking at my list here, and we got eight NHL D men on it, and one of them's Oscar Clefbaum. So we're already down to seven. And so we've got Larson, Barrie, Bear on the right side, Nurse, Russell, Jones, Lagesson on the left side. And that's assuming Bear and Lagesson get signed, which I think is a safe bet. But it's only seven. Then you got Broberg and Bouchard underneath. Now you're either expecting one of those guys to make it, or else you're expecting someone else like Dmitry Samorukov. I don't think he gets out of Russia until their season is over. And there's just really no one else that's an NHL depth defensemen under contract. So I'm still would think that there's going to be a PTO. There's going to be something that they're going to cover themselves off, and maybe it'll just be they'll bring in Jason Garrison like they did 3 years ago, and they got a guy, But I'd rather they sign one of these bargains. And you know what? You can sign a couple guys, and as long as you're not paying them more than 1.075 million, if they don't make your team and you send them down to the AHL, you can bury all their contract.
Well, that's what I'm hoping, that they luck into a few bargain basement players still that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Dominic Kahun at forward, maybe Slater Kukuk on defense. I don't think Kahun signed today, as far as I know. Like, you know what, Bruce? He had 2.2. He's averaged 2.2 points per game in the last 2 years. Taylor Hall in the last 2 years has averaged 2.3, and he got $8 million. And Dominic Kahun has averaged 2.2. He can't get a contract.
I looked Dominic Kahun up today, but I only looked at this most recent season when he split time between Pittsburgh and Buffalo. And he got traded to Buffalo at the trade deadline. And this year, out of those 671 guys that played 400 minutes, Kahun was 36th in the NHL and with 2.43 points per 60 at 5-on-5. He played 11 hours. He had 10 goals and 17 assists. Okay, that's pretty darn good.
Some teams are really analytical. You'd think that they would.
Yeah, it jumps off the screen at me, David.
Me too.
He played his most common line mate in Pittsburgh was Jared McCann. They played 300 minutes together. And Kahun got 6 goals and 8 assists playing with Jared McCann. And in Buffalo, he played 1 hour with Marcus Johansson, pretty good player, and he got 2 goals and 2 assists. And he was a plus player, like an outscorer, 5-on-5 outscorer in all 3 cities he's played. And it's a mystery to me why he's already played on 3 teams in 2 years, and even Buffalo didn't qualify him at just $925,000.
Maybe he hangs out at the Red Line or something.
Well, maybe he hangs out in the red light district. I mean, I really don't know what this backstory is. I do know Leon Draisaitl is his boyhood friend and line mate, and they absolutely lit it up in that German league. Two future NHLers in a U16 league in Germany. It's hilarious. They scored 6 points per game average, each guy. Anyway, and Kahun outscored Draisaitl. That's the eye-popping part. Anyway,
I'd love to see him signed in that, but on the other hand, Bruce, I'd love to see them give a real chance to Puljujarvi too.
Well, he's a left winger, and they got a huge gaping hole, a top 6 left wing.
Yeah, if Nygaard's hurt, but they have Tyler Benson and Nygaard. If those 2 guys are healthy, they're pretty good
and they
hockey
got a guy who
players.
Scored 2.43 points per 60 in the NHL this past season. 24 years old.
I would take him in a second. Like, to me, this seems like if you could get him on $1 million contract, and I don't know what he's waiting for at this point.
Yeah, I don't.
But I think he's waiting for it. Like, is he going to get more than that? I doubt it. The other funny one is Andreas Athanasiou, who apparently had a contract offer. And I don't know what Ken Holland offered, but whatever he offered, Athanasiou. Now this shows, and people talked about this, the calculated risk that Athanasiou's agent and he are taking. Yeah, we talked about it, and you might be badly surprised, and they have been. I think they're going to get, what will he get now? $1.5 million, $1 million. He might get a 2-year deal, but he probably won't. He's not going to. I don't think he's going to get anything starting with a 2. That'd be a shocker, but he just. Maybe Ottawa will step in at the last second here, but I doubt it.
We talked on at least 2 podcasts about that, and we said Holland's, the play for Holland is to, offer him even 2 more years, but at, not at $3 million, but we talked about $2 million. Well, the rumor I heard was that Holland did offer 2 years at 2.4, and he turned it down.
That is the rumor.
Ooh.
Well, what about bringing him back?
I'd be shocked if he gets that now. Well,
yeah. Bring him back for $1 million. You see, there are all of these really interesting players. Do you have the list, Bruce? I have the list. Let me just get the list of who's not signed here.
I think it would be so embarrassing for him to sign that contract that he would rather sign for $1 million anywhere else than here if it goes that low. But we'll see.
Mike Hoffman's out there. He'll still get an okay contract, Mike Hoffman, probably. There's lots of teams with lots of money who got absolutely jilted, like Columbus, and off the top of my head, there might be a few others. Who are the other UFAs? Dadonov. He'll get some money. UFA. Duclair. Soderberg. Soderberg had 35 points last year. Derek
34
Brassard,
years old.
32 points in 66 games. That's the kind of Kyle Turris numbers we're hoping to see.
Turris,
Like about
yeah. We
35 points. 35 points would be a nice number out of him. There's Joe Thornton. I don't know if he'll still sign with anybody or not.
Brandon Manning. Nobody signed Brandon Manning yet. I'm surprised.
Your favorite. He's such a terrible hockey player. Sorry, Brandon Manning. I'm like compared to me.
Drake Caggiula's still out there.
Oh, who would have guessed? Me. I was never, except for these play in the playoffs the one year, I was never that enamored with Drake Caggiula's play. So, anyone else, Bruce, on the free agency list that might come from like $1 million that you can see?
Oh, there's been a couple. Like I say, I got kind of on the Dominic Kahun train and went pretty deep into his stats. Like big time outscorer too. I think in his 2 years he's on the ice for 87-4 and 64 against, playing for 3 different teams. So you can't say it's just his line mates. Anyway, so he's my target. But there's
Barrie.
You know, there are guys, but if you're looking for someone that has a potential to break through that's still likely to be cheap, the list gets pretty short pretty fast.
Who do you think? So, Bruce, what do you think about the Oilers missing out on a Markstrom? I'm glad that they didn't. And when I did a thing on the winners and losers so far in this offseason, and that kind of guided my thinking. It guided my thinking in terms of making Vancouver a winner. And I know that shot, like, how could you have Vancouver on the list? Well, Vancouver just got a top number 1 defenseman, a real top pairing defenseman, hands down, no questions asked. Top pairing defenseman, age 29, so still in that sweet spot for 29, 30, 31, 32. And they got him for a 3rd round draft pick, Nate Schmidt. How could I not have Vancouver on that? That was gifted to them, but they still gladly accepted the gift, and they missed out on the Markstrom contract. They missed out on, I think, overpaying Chris Tanev, who isn't Nate Schmidt, and has signed 4 years at $4.5 million a year at Calgary. They missed out on the Markstrom contract. This is why I have Calgary as a loser in the free agency period, and Montreal. All these teams who I think overpaid and are going to regret it. Their fans are real happy today, and I've been in that boat. Hey, they signed Andrew Ference. Oh, they signed Benoit Pouliot and Mark Fane. Look at that. They signed Milan Lucic. Woo. We've all been kind of in that camp, although sometimes our heart was saying one thing and our brain was saying another in those moments. But those fans are all excited in those cities, Bruce. I think they're going to be really disappointed in about a year and a half when it all sinks in. Like the Josh Anderson contract in Montreal, the Markstrom contract in Calgary.
Remember people being excited when the Oilers signed Lucic.
Oh yeah, people were very excited.
I mean, well, you bring in a big name player with a big backstory. Now, a question from Vancouver's standpoint is they lost out on Markstrom and Tanev, who went to Calgary for shade over $10 million between the two of them, and they replaced those 2 guys with Braden Holtby and Nate Schmidt. Again, it's shade over $10 million, almost the same. So Schmidt's better than Tanev by quite a lot, and you could say Holtby's not as good as Markstrom by quite a lot. And did Vancouver come out ahead or behind? Well, if Holtby plays reasonably well, and if the Thatcher Demko that was so great in the end of the playoffs, if he's for real, I mean, then their goaltending is actually solved for a little bit cheaper, and they've used that extra money to buy a better defenseman than the aging Chris Tanev. Like I think Schmidt's a clear upgrade there, and the idea of Schmidt and Quinn Hughes on their first pairing is a little intimidating.
I really like Nate Schmidt. I really like Nate Schmidt. So I had Buffalo as a winner, and the Taylor Hall contract is listen. If he had signed a 1 year, $8 million deal in Edmonton, if we had people would have been through the roof with glee in Edmonton. The good news is because it's just a 1 year deal that we'll be having endless Taylor Hall to Edmonton stories. We've already had that rumor. I can't remember which NHL reporter had it today, but a serious NHL reporter was talking about how Taylor Hall so he wanted to come back. And that's the bad news, of course, as well. It's not going to end. We're just going to have endless, which is part of the fun. It's part of the fun. I'm not like the idea of signing Taylor Hall long term in Edmonton. If I'm completely honest, a year from now, it's even less exciting than if it would have happened today. Like I'm not a big fan of long term contracts for players heading into their 30s, and there's some exceptions to that general rule. Alex Pietrangelo, I would have made the exception. Like if the Oilers had signed him and had the cap space, I would have been okay with that because he's such a great player. Even if he diminishes by 10 or 20% or 30% over the term of that contract, he's still a top 4 NHL D man.
You like him better than Oliver Ekman-Larsson, eh?
I do, significantly better.
Well, he did bump Oliver Ekman-Larsson out of the top 5 highest paid defensemen. We talked about that in the past podcast about future contracts and what happens. Of course, some of these guys expire and then get extended. And when you get a very high-end guy, everybody else tends to get bumped down the charts. There's now 5 D-men ahead of OEL, where there used to be 4. But
Arizona's a mess right now, Bruce. They got to make amends with Ekman-Larsson. They couldn't, like my valuation of Ekman-Larsson. There were some people saying he's in the top 15. If he had been in the top 15 of NHL defensemen, he would have been moved by now. Yeah. And that didn't happen. I think that the valuation that we were giving him, which was maybe top pairing NHL defenseman, but maybe in the top 60 NHL D-men, but not in the top. That's really what his value was. So his contract doesn't match up with his playing ability at this point. So Montreal signed Anderson, Petrie, Toffoli, Edmondson, and Allen. And you think, look at that list of players. That's a good list of players. But I think they probably overpaid at least $1 million per year per player on each contract. They're even now. And if you start to factor in the years at the end of the contract, when at least 2 or 3 of those guys aren't going to be living up to that money, I just think Montreal was it. And now they've signed Brendan Gallagher to a 6-year, $6.5
million.
And these are all good hockey players. And I'm not saying if you're a Habs fan, I'm not saying these aren't good players right now. And I can see the justification on a certain level, but I just think there's a consistent pattern here of Chiarelli-like overpayments in terms and dollars for each of these players. And so that's 6 players in total in that category in the signing period.
Yeah.
3 of them, I guarantee you're going to just greatly, greatly regret. Even a year from now, 3 of those contracts. That's my bet. A year from now, you're going to really regret, and maybe 2 years from now, it's going to be 4. Hey, maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I see it. If the Oilers sign those contracts, go ahead.
Off the page for me, for Montreal, I'm looking at their forward salaries. Jonathan Drouin, currently top paid forward left wing. Josh Anderson, right wing. Thomas Tatar, both wings. Tyler Toffoli, listed here as both wings. I see him as a right winger. Brendan Gallagher, right wing. Paul Byron, both wings. Like the top 6 paid forwards are all wingers. Like, how do you build a team like that? I don't see that working.
Maybe they should have signed
maybe they
Dominic
have great
Kahun.
contracts, and maybe Kotkaniemi and Suzuki, because they're on entry-level contracts and they're players of that level and they're just not getting paid yet. But they're going to need to get paid at some point, and you're going to have all these bloody Josh Anderson contracts in the way of these guys. I just don't understand what he's doing there. He's throwing money around like crazy. I mean, this Jake Allen. He traded for the last year of Jake Allen's contract, and without him ever playing one game in Montreal, he just gave him a 2-year extension.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Today.
Today.
It's slightly lower pay than before, but still very well paid to be Carey Price's backup for 3 years. I mean, I guess it's a plan. You could say that's a plan, but the overall plan just strikes me as throwing money at a wall and seeing if any of it sticks.
It's kind of Tambellini-esque, isn't it? I mean, this is really what it reminds me of, and so does Benning. Like Benning's work in Vancouver is
It's more
Tambellini-esque.
Shirelli-esque, actually.
Benning got lucky, I think,
Hmm.
with Nate Schmidt because it was headed for a kind of a disastrous offseason there, because they had lost useful players to their team and they hadn't been replacing them, and partly because they had spent so much money on third and fourth line players who just are really marginal NHLers at this point. So some I don't know. We've been through this in Edmonton so much. You'd be so much better off just waiting. If Montreal just waited and signed Dominic, Kahun, and Andreas Athanasiou, let's say they had signed four guys like that right now to about $1 million to $1.5 million each, because they're out there,
Yeah. Oh,
and you
yeah.
had done that. Who's to say that Kahun and Athanasiou aren't going to outscore Josh Anderson and Tyler Toffoli this year? Because at points per game, they're all similar.
Well,
So
Josh Anderson scored 1 goal and I think 4 points in 26 games last year. And he spent the rest of the game injured with some kind of chronic injury. So, assuming he comes back healthy, I mean, obviously the injury must have affected his performance. I mean, 1 goal. But when you take on that kind of a risk and you invest, I mean, they traded Max Domi to bring the guy over. Why pay full freight on a full term 7 year deal?
and
Like,
they traded Max Domi, who was there. He scored 2.5 per 60 over the last 2 years. Josh Anderson's at 1.6 per 60.
mhm,
Like that is a huge gap in scoring.
yeah.
That's the difference between a first line hockey player in the NHL and a third line hockey player in the NHL. Now maybe Josh Anderson brings all these intangibles that Max Domi doesn't have, and I don't know, but to me that just on the face of it, the trade made no sense. I guess Max Domi probably wanted out of Montreal is the story. But
Yeah.
so another team that won, Bruce, and I hate to say this, Colorado. First
Hmm.
of all, they resisted the Markstrom alert. Like they resisted going after the big goalie when they've got two pretty decent goalies there. By save percentage, two really good goalies in Francouz and what's the other guy, Grubauer.
Hmm.
And so they resisted spending a lot of money on a goalie. There's lots of pressure on them to do that because of recency bias in the playoffs. And those two goalies didn't come up big. And then, so they resisted that. And then they've got Devin Taves, who I thought I was, from the playoffs that I watched and just looking at his numbers, how much the coach trusted him with ice time and his points per game, points per 60 in those ice time exposures. Devin Taves is a top four D man in the NHL,
Hmm.
and they got him for 2 second-round draft picks. So that Colorado team, Joe Sakic, he's done really well, and Schmidt falling into Vancouver hands and Taves falling into Colorado hands really bummed me out. Barrie kind of fell into our hands. Tyson Barrie did, but Devin Taves and Schmidt, like Schmidt's a really good player, and so is Taves. So
Well, they picked up Brandon
yeah,
Saad from Chicago,
yeah,
also in Colorado,
yeah.
and they traded out Zadorov, second pairing defenseman, and then they replaced Zadorov with Taves, and I don't know, I think that may well be an upgrade.
I
And
think so,
Brandon Saad
definitely.
up front is an upgrade for sure. So they've done some nice work back there. Joe Sakic is uh, Trader Joe. They're going to have to start calling this guy.
I also have Vegas as a winner. They spent a lot of money on Peter Angelo and on Robin Leonard. But honestly, if I was an Oilers fan and they had signed Robin Leonard to that contract and Peter Angelo, I I would have been a little worried with Peter Angelo, but I would have been really happy too. I think those are good bets because those are, they got the best goalie on the UFA market and they got the best defenseman. So then they had to shed some players. So they, Paul, which Stastny was it? I'm
So
forgetting.
Paul
It's,
Stuss, yeah.
it's Paul. Paul Stastny. There's been so many. Paul Stastny. No, I don't think he's actually that much of a loss at this stage of his career. They have got the young center there, Cody Glass, who needs some ice time, and they had to give up Nate Schmidt. Now that I think that's an interesting one because it's like it seems like the heart of that team on a certain level was players like Schmidt and Fleury, and they're kind of changing. They're dabbling with the chemistry there, seeing if they can bring in new players and still have the same magic that team seemed to have together. Maybe that's not going to be there, but if I was a fan, like just trading, Stastny and Schmidt for Pietrangelo and Leonard, yeah, I'd do. I would make that trade anytime. So I like
Well,
that.
Vegas, they've lost the advantage they had when they first came in, which was cap space.
Yeah,
They didn't have a bunch of lousy contracts on their books. They didn't have a bunch of dead cap space like a lot of teams do. Oilers, and um, they were able to go out. I mean, they went out after their great first year, and they basically traded for or signed an entire second line of mid-career star players, basically, and Max Pacioretty, Paul Stastny, and Mark Stone. And they paid all of them. Like two of them, they were bought when they were at rentals at the deadline, and they just paid him. They paid Stone $9.5 million, and Pacioretty got, I think, better part of 7 million. And of course, they got Stastny on the free agent market. It's because they kind of had, well, we got 20 million in cap space. How best to spend it to fix up our forwards? Now all of a sudden they got a great second line behind a great first line, and but now 3 years in, and all that cap space is basically used. And anytime they want to add a player, they have to clear space for them. So they're adding and subtracting instead of just adding, like it seemed like they were doing for the first couple of years. So
someone just signed Mike Hoffman because I'm just looking at the UFA list, and suddenly it seemed like Hoffman was on it, but maybe I'm incorrect about that. So there's still
he's
in
still out
terms.
there.
Okay, yeah, okay. Let me just go to. Oh, I'm there. Okay, is he?
Third on the list.
Um, in terms of, there still could be a huge winner in free agency. Like if you can go in there, let's say you scoop up, Kahun, Athanasiu, maybe you sign Dadonov to a bargain contract at this point, or Hoffman to a bargain contract. There still could be a team that jumps to the front of the pack. There might be some defensemen, like everyone seems to like Slater Kukuk, at least in Edmonton. There could be some really good signings yet to come, so we'll see. And some teams could be shooting up on terms of where they rank overall. Hopefully they're not teams in the Oilers division. Hopefully it's not Colorado who signs Athanasiu and Kahun for their fourth line.
There's going to be PTOs, of course, galore, and once training camp happens, and I think you're going to see some. I mean, it does happen every year, but this year it may be even more, a little higher caliber of players on the PTO that are fighting for jobs. And
Yeah,
in the last couple of years, we've seen cases where PTO came in and he didn't have a contract. We thought there's a pretty darn good chance that guy's going to make the team, and he did. And I think that we're going to see a little bit more of that.
alrighty, Bruce. Anything else?
Mike Smith.
You have some final words on Mike Smith?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of feedback on Mike Smith, and I think you got it right. It seemed like it was 80 to 90% of people didn't like the Mike Smith contract.
Oh,
But
even
when you put out
99%.
a poll saying would you rather have the Mike Smith contract or the Jacob
Markstrom.
Markstrom contract, it was 2-1 in favor of preferring the Mike Smith contract. So that says a lot right there.
I
Think
forgot
about
about that. Yeah.
my take on it is that there's a lot of guys in this town, and I think all hockey towns, where people, they would like the player except for the fact they hate his contract. I mean, Chris Russell is the poster boy for that in this town. I think Alex Chason. There's more, but Mike Smith is almost the other way around. He's a player where, well, Jesus, things we don't like about that player, and that's the player that people were reacting to when they didn't like the signing. But his contract's not that bad, and he took a significant cut. Like he didn't just bring him back at the same deal. He took a $500,000 cut in his base salary, and a massive cut in his bonuses from 1.75 million to just 500,000. So the most he can make if he makes all of his bonuses is 2 million. Last year that was his base, and then he built a bunch of significant bonuses on top of that. And the increments of the bonuses were last year was 125,000. This year it's just 50,000 when he achieves these various things. Like, it's a way tighter contract, and if he doesn't play well, you can say that contract's no good from the get-go, and you'll have a case. Last year he played well some of the time, and he came pretty close to covering the bet on that contract. Like, he made way less than Koskinen did, and they split the load, and they split the wins and losses, and the minutes, and the games played, and the starts and everything, uh, right down the middle. And now Koskinen's still getting paid, and Smith is getting cut back that little more. I think you'll see a 60-40 relationship, 65-35, with Koskinen getting more starts. But the Smith contract fits into the sort of leaner, um, uh, the less available cap. And I mean, obviously, Holland convinced Smith, that there wasn't enough money available, and I'd see people saying, well, they should have just given him the minimum wage. He'd be lucky just to get the NHL minimum. I don't know. That seems harsh. Like, the guy's been the number one goalie. I mean, he led his team in starts and minutes and everything in the last 2 or 3 years since he came to Calgary and Edmonton, and he swallowed his pride and took a significant pay cut. I mean, I just don't get this business of, well, just give him the bare minimum like he's worthless or entry level player. He's way more than that.
All right, well, you make that argument, Bruce, in your post tonight.
I'm going to be writing a post tonight. It's not going to be like totally in favor of Smith, but this everything bad, nothing good about the guy is just wrong.
I think that's completely a fair point on your part, and I'm glad that you're making that point, because he did take a ton of crap
some
and
of
abuse.
It from us.
Some of it from us. And I think the reaction was honest and real and fair, but on some level. But on another level, like, he had one bad month last year, really bad.
26 bad minutes.
Other than that, was pretty darn good, and one terrible playoff game. So he can still he's not a bad backup goalie. And as I was saying, I just think the Oilers are better off this year in net than they were last year, because I'm just that much more convinced Koskinen is a starting goalie in the NHL. Markstrom, the mighty Markstrom had a .918 save percentage. Koskinen was .917, but roughly the same number of games. I think they're roughly the same age, same size, and yet, people in Calgary are overjoyed about this contract that they've given Markstrom. And Edmonton were thinking, we lost. Some people are thinking, well, we've lost out on something. We didn't lose. I just think, I don't get that. And I don't know why the Oilers, and what troubles me a little bit is why the Oilers offered all that money to Koskinen as well, if it's true that they did, or to Markstrom. I don't know why Oilers management did that. I think, I just think, honestly, we dodged a huge bullet, and it doesn't, I think it's, if you want to look for a negative about Ken Holland's performance this year in the trade deadline, if that's true, $5 million a year for 7 years from Markstrom, that's it for me. Like, Ken Holland, like, I'm not sure. I don't know where your head was when you're making that, because you're really weighing your team down for a long, long time with a big, big contract on a goalie who may or may not play that well over 7 years. Like, do you think you're signing Martin Brodeur or Dominic Hasek? I didn't like that. I didn't like this. So if I was to give him a negative mark, if that's true, it would be related to that. Like, I didn't like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, as bullet dodged, or as maybe, I mean, in the end, the Oilers actually cut down their goaltending budget to between $6 and $6.5 million for both goalies. And the other thing about the Smith contract is it's at $1.5 million. In a worst case scenario, if he comes in and he just loses it and he's lost it, for one thing, Holland did actually sign a third goalie with NHL experience this year, which they never had last year. They spent the whole season on the tightrope without a net.
Yeah.
If someone had gone down, they were going to bring up some totally inexperienced guy to replace him. Now they got this Anton Forsberg. If Smith craps the bed, they send him out and they bring up Forsberg. They actually save $375,000. And I mean, they're paying Smith some $425,000 for his Barrie contract, but they bring up Forsberg at NHL minimum, and they're actually saving money. So they at least have a plan B that's built in. And Forsberg, he's got some pretty nice history that, I'm not saying he's going to be great, but I think he might be adequate as an NHL backup.
Yeah, I really like the Forsberg signing a lot.
So
for the reasons you just enunciated. Hey, Bruce, I've got to get going here, so
yep, fair enough.
why don't we wrap it up now? That's so, yeah. Well, I do have to get going as the main issue. Yeah. Not that you've said it. We could still talk for another hour, I'm sure, and people would be on their they would be gripped. They would be on the edge of their seats, wondering what our next utterance would be. But
we'll talk for an hour on a different day.
Exactly. Thanks for talking today.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.